Well, today's a special guest. Today is Brad Jersak. Am I pronouncing the last name correctly?
You are.
Okay. I had the opportunity to read his most recent book that's coming out. We're going to post this the day of on November 22nd, Out of the Embers. And Brad, thank you. This is a pleasure. It really is. Yeah.
Likewise, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I I have written down you are the Dean of Theology and Culture at St. Stephen's University. I've already read a number of your other books, but Her Gates Will Never Be Shut, A More Christ-Like Word, Way, and God, the trilogy. Jesus Showed Us, which is a great children's book. Children, Can You Hear Me? Another children's book, but Out of the Embers is the most recent one, yeah? Is there anything
Yeah.
else you'd like to say beyond that to explain yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's other books out there, but you're right. I'm actually living on the west coast of Canada, but we have a modular program at St. Stephen's University in New Brunswick. So grad study students come from all over, whether in person or online, and we have an awesome time just talking about these kind of topics there. So you're catching me between grading papers from last semester and preparing schedules for next semester. And I'll do a shout out to the school if you're interested
Go for it.
in grad studies. You could do an MA or an MIN in theology and culture and study with me. And so just maybe in the show notes you can put
Sure.
my email and ssu.ca.
Okay. Is there a doctoral program there as well?
No, there's not, but we love to send people on from our school into doctoral programs. Yeah.
Right. Well, I let me say the first thought about your book, Out of the Embers, first two immediate thoughts. First one was it's called Out of the Embers, not Out of the Ashes. And I don't know if that anyone else notices titles the way that I do, but I thought that was interesting. The title was immediately about something that's still burning, something that's still giving off light and warmth. How'd you stumble into that title there?
Oh, I'm sure I did a brainstorming session with some creative people, but what I loved about it is exactly what you're saying. I was in my mind was the image of a phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a kind of a resurrection theme, but then at the same time, my experience is that well, to quote a song, hope is fragile, but it's hard to kill.
Mm-hmm.
And so my own experience, I'll use a different analogy, was when the bulldozer of life came over and
Mm-hmm.
flattened me. I was shocked to find out that somehow there was still something left. I don't know
Yeah.
why I could say God is good after my traumas and my missteps, but the fact that I could was bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
Or some of the stories in the books are like that too. In the book is like that. We had one guy, ex-pastor in a psych ward,
Mm-hmm.
reaches out to me and he's like, I don't even believe in God anymore. But I called out to him, and when I did, the name Jesus came out of my mouth, and then your name came to mind. So I contacted you. Like this idea,
Yeah.
like, whoa, something was left, something
Yeah.
even there, you know. So
I think his name was
yeah,
Nathan, if I remember. Or
yeah,
at least you
yeah.
printed as Nathan.
That's right. Uh, Nathan in scare quotes. Actually, I think it was actually his name. He gave me permission.
I I finished reading it, and even early on, I thought that this was the best final statement, I hope, about deconstruction. I think I'm a little bit like you. I saw a video of you that seemed as though I'm tired of this term. And it's been in pop culture for a good number of years now, and I feel as though sometimes it's carried cynicism and it doesn't have a healthy energy behind it. But I honestly think your book about faith deconstruction and what's happening with American Christianity right now, I think it might be the best book I've read on the topic. And I'm not just saying that. I also have read a few others. And I think yours is the best. Yeah.
Well, that's super kind. I know what you mean though. Like in the sense of, okay, one, can we just not dismiss this major thing that's happened, but also,
Sure.
like, could we get through the door somehow? And like, I'm ready to move on, but if we need a doorman, maybe I can be of some service. And others are just going to start heading into it, so you and I,
Mhm.
maybe things we've been where we've unraveled 10 or 15 years ago, others are just getting to it. So, to mix metaphors again, if I could be a midwife of sorts,
Oh
I
yeah.
think something good can be birthed out of this, but it's certainly not the end game.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think I don't. I hope doesn't sound too corny. I think I deconstructed before it was cool. It was a good 12, 14 years ago. But the catch up of culture has been very interesting with the advent of the internet taking off. And really, people are able to do their own Google searches, and the Me Too movement, information travels so much faster. And frankly, you can learn things about the history of the faith without going to seminary in a way that didn't quite exist exactly before. But if I could, I would like to talk about the beginning chapters of your book and not go too much into the later stuff. Even though it's amazing, I think that might be good to hook some people. And
Sure.
I would like to start with on page 33, you do a list that I found was incredibly helpful about different metaphors to talk about this thing called deconstruction of faith. You have metaphors, and then you have Christ-like metaphors. And what I thought was so fascinating, so helpful, is that I've had conversations with people that have gone through a deconstruction, they've disassembled or whatever, but that term makes it just about a building, something not something static. And I thought your list of metaphors was very helpful. Can you tell me how'd you come to this metaphor of alternative ways to talk about deconstruction?
Yeah, some of it was like, I recognize that deconstruction is a technical term that a philosopher um, came up with in the 60s, Jacques Derrida, but that's not how it was being used anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I listened carefully to how it was being used, and most of it had to do with either dismantling or demolishing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, well, I mean, yes, that's one way to look at it. But then friends like Brian Zahn said, but for other people, this is more like meant to be an art restoration project, and
Mm.
you don't uncover the beauty and genius of a Da Vinci that's with with a machete. You've got to take
That's
care.
true.
And I really thought that way about the human heart and human faith. So it's one thing if we think about deconstruction as, well, let's go burn the churches down or something, but like, hang on, what if we're talking about a person's heart here, or we're talking
Mm.
about their faith, then in some ways we need to take much more care and be gentle and empathetic. And then on the other hand, I thought, you know, deconstruction doesn't go nearly far enough in other ways, like,
Mm-hmm.
right? So rebirth or death and resurrection, or
Yeah.
like that feels much more thorough and deeper and rigorous even than, while I'm having some doubts about some stuff, And so, yeah, the metaphors started multiplying, and then I started seeing them more and more in scripture, to the point where we won't say much about later in the book, but I will say the fountainhead of deconstruction might have been Moses, and
Yeah.
melting down the golden calf, which is something we could certainly do today with some of what Christianity's become,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, and isn't that part of the difficulty is so much has gotten mixed up with Christianity. It's almost as though how do you know what's worthwhile and to keep and what needs to be burned up, what needs to be thrown out? And I thought you did a great job and of talking about apophatic theology.
Yeah.
And how would you describe that to the average person? I've got an MDiv. I've been to seminary, but how would you describe apophaticism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, for those who haven't heard the term before, or if it's a sloppy term, another way of describing it is negative theology. And so, apophatic theology is a way of thinking about what God is not.
Hmm.
And so, um, cataphatic theology, we make positive statements about God, like God is love,
Mm.
God is all knowing, God is ever present, God is, these kind of positive statements. Apophatic theology says, yes, but whatever we say about God can become a construct and even an idol. And so, even
Mm.
true things we say about God, here'd be a very practical one for people who've struggled with uh, let's call them daddy issues. Yes, God is a father, but then you also have to ask right away, how is God not a father? How is God not like your
Mm.
father? How is father a much too small and narrow of a description of God?
Mm.
So that would be one example, or a more extreme one that comes up among the first Christians is we've thought of God almost like as a god, and he's not a god among other gods. He's he can, that's a category error. um, in fact, even to call God a being is too small, too narrow. We would say God is beyond being, and in Him everything lives and moves and has its being. So now what we're doing there is we're saying what are the words and concepts and images we have for God that okay, they describe him to a degree, but also they
Mm.
become a cage. They
Yeah.
become a box we put him in. And so apophatic theology is saying those kind of boxes actually hinder intimacy with
Mm.
God. And so what a great thing to deconstruct then, right? We're going to deconstruct every every box that limits God or hinders our approach to him. Well, I'm into that then. That's not just destructive or demolition of faith. In fact, it's a recovery and a sort of
Mm.
an unveiling. So, isn't the tearing of the veil in the temple a kind of deconstruction, right?
Uh-huh.
But what is it unto? Well, it's unto drawing near, not running away.
Apophatic theology. You know what? As you're talking, it reminded me of Meister Eckhart when he says, "I
Yeah.
pray God rid me of God." Which
Yes.
to some people that sounds like a paradox, and of course he's a master of paradox. But I love the idea, and I think I preached it once on a Good Friday service, that sometimes it takes for God to dismantle our idolatrous views of God.
Yes. Yeah.
And I found that thought so liberating, but I could see it scared the average churchgoer. And I think that your book is fantastic. I really do. But it seems as though if you haven't been hurt by the church or felt the limitations of the theology you're living in, you may not want to pick up this book yet. But maybe in a few years you might.
It's possible, I because I do put out the trauma there so directly, right?
Right.
That okay, what if you've been traumatized? But remember also that I like to talk about how it can also be very liberating. So not just
Mhm.
through trauma, but like, wow, if I could have an ever expansive view of God, that no matter how good my experience has been, He's better than that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm hoping that even those who've not been traumatized could make some use of it wherever they are still, let's say, limiting God themselves, you know,
Oh, yes.
and through, like, let's say, too much certainty about who God is and what God is, and reducing God to doctrines we've just
Mm.
inherited without really interrogating them. And so for those folks, I'm like, actually, you could probably do with a little deconstruction if you're just cruising, and if you think like uh, um, uh, the comforts of suburban Christianity are sort of describe God, a projection of my own mortgage onto onto the Lord. That's probably going to need to be challenged, and so my book would help them to be proactive in that sense. and
Right.
especially around the Dostoevsky chapters on, have
Mm.
you really looked at the problem of evil and suffering, and or
And
are we
ideology
just too
too.
comfortable? Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
brought that
Especially
in.
in the culture wars now, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think that your book, and people like Brian Zond as well, and even Pete Enns. I went to an event that he was at a week or so ago, and it feels as though the best theologians like yourself are the ones that they're motivated by almost a pastoral response. You're not just trying to do scholasticism for scholasticism's sake. It's that this type of really good theology, like you said, it's incredibly liberating. And I'll be honest, I worked in church world for 20 years before shifting to the university. And I remember many times my supervisors would tell me to stop quoting John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, Soren Kierkegaard. And there's a part of me that feels as though we really set ourselves up for this kind of collapse by not doing good scholastic pastoral theology.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I would strongly agree. I do think, I'm not a very good Christian, but I do think I'm a good theologian. And
Okay.
this is why this is why I think that. It's exactly what you said. I think theology should be coming in behind the real questions that people are struggling with, and that it might describe after the fact their encounters with God and sort of bring a bit of an analysis to it, but it shouldn't be like prescriptive. So when I think about the actual order of operations here, it's like I was a pastor 20 years. I found out some of the real questions people have and some of the real stumbles we make.
Mm.
And then it raises these hard questions. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go ask Kierkegaard what he thinks.
Oh,
and
good.
and maybe he can tell me like what to say to these folks. But I think it's, yeah, pastoral at the very heart of it. In fact, I wouldn't have written it otherwise. It's not clear to me that a theology that is uprooted from pastoral realities is worth
Mm.
very much at all. Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually quite vulnerable, I think. And you start off the book rather early on, again, being vulnerable, talking about how you had reached your terminus as a pastor in 2008.
Yeah.
And I think people are used to hearing of congregants hitting that wall. But it's very rare that you hear somebody from a pastoral field talk about hitting that wall as publicly as you did. So, can you tell us about that? Because I think people need to know that pastors have these same questions too.
Yeah, it's really true. I have a lot of acquaintances who are ex-pastors, and
Hmm.
I guess they might say this stuff, but they don't have a platform anymore. Somehow I still ended up with a platform to say, I was a pastor and here's what happened to me. Um, Others of my friends, they would only say those in like in a sex
Hmm.
addicts anonymous room or something, where things have come apart at the seams, and it's really, really hard to be a pastor. And so
Hmm. Hmm.
one example I can give is how just, um, I go and I did a MA and an MDiv and 4 years of Bible college, and I came away with a couple of counseling courses. And now I'm seen as a pastoral counselor in a congregation of traumatized people. The
Mm.
fact is,
Hmm.
I was not qualified for that. And in my own brokenness, I suppose you could say that my relationship to the congregation was codependency, like the
Hmm.
wife or husband or child of an alcoholic. That's not on them, that's on me, but I didn't know better, and I
Mm.
definitely shouldn't have been counseling them. And I'm like, what's going on with this? So pastors experience these kind of pressures, and then over time, um, long-term stress and disappointment, um, and disillusionment really leaves you, in a bad place. I remember a guy coming to me and saying, my pastor. really let me down. I'm like, well, how did he let you down? It's like, well, it was so bad I can't even go to church anymore. I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard these stories. I'm sorry. What
Uh-huh.
did he do? It's like, well, he didn't believe in young Earth creationism, and I just had to leave because he's a heretic. I'm like, what?
Wow.
So you had a disagreement, and you were more conservative than your pastor. So now you just watch TV preachers, and this is on the pastor somehow. So
Wow.
I'm like, when I hear how congregations have experienced spiritual abuse through leadership. I understand that, but I also know that that's a two-way street, and sometimes pastors have been crucified by the expectations
Mhm.
either of the congregation or the ones they've internalized for themselves. And for me, that was part of it. I needed to
Sure.
hold something together that was coming apart. And when God wasn't holding it together, what is that? Well, Messiah complex, I guess. So
Yeah.
it's messy. I don't even know what to say. Like, God bless the pastors, but I'm glad I'm not one. I don't,
Right.
you know. I think I had some really great experience as a pastor, but I probably have PTSD from it too. So, you know.
It's a sad but true thing, and I don't exactly know what it looks like moving forward. I do think that maybe American Christianity's hit a lockstep because I
Yeah.
think we've at least become aware that I think I think Brian Zahn talks about it in your preface. He wrote the preface, correct?
The forward, yeah,
The
yeah,
forward,
yeah.
sorry. And he talks about how American Christianity feels like an extension of European colonialism that was mixed with American capitalism. And I think that we've kind of maybe gone as far as we could without openly acknowledging that. Because when you have the competing interests of keeping a church open versus the competing interests of trying to speak a deep and truthful faith that's grounded in tradition, those
Yeah.
things don't always go well together.
No, you're exactly right. I think that's right. Now here's a glitch that Lisa Sharon Harper has thrown in the mix.
A
Brian and
glitch?
I, oh
Okay.
man. So here's the glitch. So Brian Zahn and I were at part of a conference recently in New Orleans. I zoomed in for it. He flew there.
Uh-huh.
Um, and one of the other panelists was Lisa Sharon Harper, and the topic was something like um, inconvenient or inevitable, or maybe it was unavoidable conversations. That was the name of the conference. So we're part of this, and we're talking like you and I are talking about the state of the Christian church, and in
Uh-huh.
fact how that brand has become like really problematic, and in fact it's been co-opted in some areas by white nationalism and all of that. And then Lisa Sharon Harper, she's this elder statesman in the body of Christ, a black activist pastor. Okay, she says this: well, I just want you to know, if you leave the church because you're offended that it by its white nationalism without investigating black faith in America, leaving is still an act of white nationalism. Or what do
Wow.
you call it? Yeah, was
Wow.
it white? You know what I mean? And so,
Uh-huh.
so you and I have these assumptions when we were talking church there, and I'm like, that's the glitch. She throws a grenade in the room, right, and says, "Well, that's still very in-house of you, isn't it? You know that
Yeah.
white people go to church, and white people are offended by church, and white people are offended by how white the church is. Like, have you been to a black church yet?" So I am very interested then in what we missed from that voice, and from the Latino
Absolutely.
voices, and from the alternative voices outside the camp. But isn't it the status quo that we're talking about, right? And that
Yeah.
that requires the kind of, I don't know. Is it too late to save it? Even I'm not sure. We'll see. There might be some embers there.
Absolutely. I went to a predominantly black seminary here in Philly, and I think it was exactly what I needed to go through. Okay.
Mm,
And my
yeah.
preaching professor was this great black professor, just these amazing sermons. And I learned so much about delivery, of course, but his content was always so good. But I don't know if I can summarize a whole semester in one sentence, but he said, black sermons get to the point where the people in the pews will turn to each other and say, did they really just say that? And it's the idea of just poke the bear, but it
Yeah.
feels as though the black church has done a better job of staying prophetic in America, far better. And
Yeah, that
that's my
feels right to me.
observation on the East Coast.
I'm with you there, and I'm so glad that you had that experience. I think that that sort of demonstrates the point, doesn't it? If
Mhm.
we could have that broader, diverse experience, we actually might be less jaded, right? Oh, there is still a prophetic voice. We just
Yeah.
need to know where to find it and hear what it sounds like, and maybe even learn to emulate it.
Once a year, usually in the spring semester, I teach Intro to Christian Spirituality for college
Mm,
freshmen and sophomores. And
okay.
one of them said that their absolute favorite lecture of the whole semester was John of the Cross and talking about the dark night of the soul, which you actually talk about in the same chapter with Moses and all of that.
Yeah.
And it feels to me as though what's happening is there is something like a large collective dark night of the soul that people don't even know about, but it's fascinating because it's right there in the tradition, but
Yes.
people don't know it because it's not talked about as a normative part of the faith to go through that.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah,
could
that's
you
really good.
okay, could you riff on that?
I I
Yeah.
could riff on that probably. So how you said it was so good though, because it's sort of like this. It's like, oh no, I'm losing my faith. It's like, no, this is the faith. But I'm sort of in this dark night of the soul. Yes, that's the tradition.
That's welcome to the tradition.
Welcome. And that it's like, oh no, I've lost God. It's like, no, it's just dark because you're inside his fist, and it's the safest place you've ever been.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, so I remember actually a congregant telling me that that's how he described it. He was saying, "I'm going through dark night of the soul." It's like, and I'm like, "Oh, that's an interesting word for it." And then he describes this idea that initially, um, he was terrified that he didn't love Jesus anymore, but he's crying as he tells me. I'm like, "Well, then where are the tears coming from?" Right? And
Absolutely.
then we finally did come to that conclusion that yeah, it's dark right now, but in the actual poem that John of the Cross writes and then does commentary on it, he does describe it almost like this safe place. It's like
Yes.
instead of instead of seeing it as, and I have seen this too, where it's like I'm a kite that's had its string cut and now I'm crashed into a tree. Well, that's not the dark night of the soul. That's something else going on. But like what if in our tradition um, we highly value that experience and learn to discern it when it's happening and then walk with those for whom it they've lost let's say how does he term it, it's like you don't sense God, and he's
The
really good about
sweetness is
this.
gone.
Yeah,
Aridity.
the aridity, which is a good, that's old ancient word for dryness, right? So I'm so dry right now. Well, what happened was a lot of pastors would address this dryness as if it's an apathy problem. It's like
Hmm.
it's not an apathy problem at all. Well, maybe for some it is, but if you can identify it as apathy, then it's still not the dark night of the soul.
That's
Well, maybe
true.
it's mental illness. No, then it's still not dark night
Still
of the
not
soul.
Dark Night of the Soul. Yeah.
But I've had a tragedy. Then it's not Dark Night of the Soul. So he's doing what it's not. But then he's like, no, but there is this authentic kind of aridity where we go out into the desert and we wrestle our demons and we meet God. But it's a
Yeah.
very strange place, and one that Christ encountered too in himself.
Mm.
He would have experienced this, perhaps in the 40 days in the wilderness, certainly on the cross. He
Yes.
goes there with us, right?
Yeah. I didn't think of this beforehand, but Ewan McGregor did a movie a couple years ago called Last Days in the Desert, where it's supposed
Yes.
to be Christ in the desert, and of course he has a conversation with Satan, and he
Yep.
plays the part of Satan as well.
Yeah.
I was like, that's brilliant.
It was brilliant. It's a slow movie, beautiful
Hmm.
videography, but the idea is really important, I think, and where it is. Perhaps what Jesus was confronting was his potential shadow side.
Oh, in Jungian
Um,
terms, yeah.
yeah, and that it's a potential shadow side in that will he surrender to what he could be and the demands of the ego, and he's like, well, no, actually I won't, but but
Yeah.
I did. So there's a couple ways you can get to humility. One is through perfect surrender, and another is
That's
through
right.
screwing up royally. So
Yeah.
I took the screwing up royally side, and Jesus took the perfect surrender side, and we
Yeah.
met somehow, which was kind of neat.
That's always a miracle, right?
Yeah.
I think what makes your story of 2008 makes you credible to write this book. And I think it's in Ascent to Mount Carmel. John of the Cross says, be careful who you talk to about your dark night of the soul. Because just like you
Mm.
already said, unless somebody's been through it, they'll give you bad advice. It's like, oh, you don't like reading Bible anymore? Here's your problem. You should get reading it every single day now. It's like, oh, you hate the treadmill? Let's just speed it up then. It's like,
Yeah.
that's not the solution, right?
No,
But
no.
here's two flip side questions. I'd love
Okay.
to hear what was the easiest part of the book to write, and then what do you think was the most difficult part to write? You can do
Oh,
either one
that's
first. It doesn't matter.
yeah. Okay. Let's see. Boy, in retrospect, none of it felt very easy, but I suppose, yeah, yeah, the easiest part was when people would write me emails and I would copy and paste them into the book.
You do fill
But-
it with a good number of anecdotes and stories, which is great.
yeah, and I think in some ways that was, I want to say that was easy because it was relational. I mean, it was
Yeah.
hard stuff in the sense
Hmm.
of that these were people in a lot of pain, but somehow it's like telling stories about real life is I don't know if easy is the right word, but that did flow. I could do that. Um, and then some of the harder parts to write. There was two kinds of hard parts.
Mm.
One hard part was just the part that required more research than I was expecting, and I would go
Mm.
down a rabbit hole. I'm like, oh, this is deeper than I thought. And how am I going to be able to come out of this and communicate it? I don't know if I can. So I'm
Mm.
down in, it's sort of like if you're down in a gold mine and you meet these old miners and you're like, okay, how am I gonna set a kiosk up at the surface?
Yeah.
The other hard part was like even just emotionally. So
Yeah.
so when I even just copy and pasted my old resignation letter in, I had the worst nightmares I've had in 20 years that night. So when I was sort of going through my meltdown, I was getting triggered. I was triggering myself with it,
Hmm.
and I'm like, well, this is interesting. And by triggering, that's become such a pop term too. It's like everything triggers us now, but I actually mean like that biological triggering of where there's a cortisol problem and you go into fight or flight mechanism, and then you can't
Hmm.
turn the internal alarm systems off, and it buggers up your sleep, and like so actually bodily reactions to
Hmm.
those parts. I'm like, oh, I guess I'm not as healed as I thought I was, and I accept that.
Oh,
So I head off to the 12-step meeting, talk to my sponsor, talk to my godfather. They
absolutely.
talk me off the list, but I'm like, this is worth doing
Yeah.
if it's going to help others.
You can't
So
lead
I
someone where you haven't gone yourself. Yeah.
maybe I like. It seems like Jesus didn't have to do it the hard way. Well, he did it the hard way, but I mean,
Okay.
like without the, he's not a cautionary tale of failure, but I'm happy to be one. Like if I can. It's weird though because you'd rather just climb in a hole and
Sure.
become obscure, but I do feel strongly that the Lord's. I could be wrong, but it's like I'm not done paying forward the mercy I received.
Oh,
And so okay, if that's the cost of it, I'm happy for that. I'll do
wow.
that.
Well, and I feel as though I have been around people that have given bad advice about deconstruction, and they're really just speaking from as if they're an authority on something they haven't really gone through. And I don't know if you listen to rap music, but Kendrick Lamar did an album called Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. It was his first one in 5 years. But he wrote it over COVID, And the whole thing is an exploration of grief.
Wow.
It's an exploration of trauma from his father and from his mother, and speaking about his own family and his own processing. And there actually was a line which you said of, I guess I'm not as healed as I thought I was.
Mm.
And there
Yeah.
seems to be, and he identifies as a Christian. He's an artist, so he's obviously showing all the dualities of humanity at the same time.
Yeah.
But I really think it's almost like this season of deconstruction has been happening the past 5, 6 years, however many. It has the potential to create some really good art if people are led into it in a helpful way, you know?
Yeah, that's true. I've seen that. I think that's
Mm,
exactly right. And the trick for some is like, artists where they're really inspired by their Dark Nights,
yeah,
but then not sure how to come out of them without ruining their art.
it's
It's
true.
like, I don't want to go back to being happy clappy because that's not it, but maybe there's a way forward that carries along the wisdom that came from
That's
those
right.
places, right?
And I think you only have one, if I remember. You include a drawing in there from David Hayward,
Yeah.
and for those that don't have a copy of it, it's a man sitting in a boat and he's baiting a shark with a question mark, and the shark is deconstruction, which is, you could probably unpack that for a while too. But is there any art that you found that you might have included in the book but you didn't?
Yeah, it's expensive to put art in books, especially if in
I didn't
color,
know
right?
that.
But
Yeah.
it's like really not, yeah. And then you've got the copyright issues and all of that. But I'm really drawn to crucifixion art.
Mm,
For me, the punchline had been that this is what saved my life, and you saw it in the book. Simone Weil saved my life,
hmm.
along with the living people who walked me through stuff. And her thing was this, that when we can acknowledge that the goodness of God and the affliction of humanity is a real contradiction,
Mm,
and if we can stop trying to rationalize the two together through our theodicies, which just end up making God evil or evil good, and then say this is a real contradiction, and just be astonished by it,
mm,
and then see the distance between the two is infinite. So the goodness of God is infinitely distant from the affliction of humanity. But that contradiction functions like pinchers that grab you and arrest you and throw you down
oh wow.
at the foot of the cross. At the foot of the cross, I looked up and I saw in that man the goodness of God and the affliction of man intersecting,
Mm,
spanning the distance. And the whole timeline of humanity between the two nail holes in his hands, and my affliction nailing me to his heart, and from his
wow.
wounds healing love flowing out. That's just all Simone Weil. That's what I saw in 2008, 2009 when I it was the beginning, what was the end of my suicidal ideations and the beginning of my healing. And I'm like, and if I take everything I just said to you and I bring it as an explanation, it still doesn't work. It was an experience. It's an encounter. And I think that's the crux, literally,
Oh yeah.
um, is I don't the people who come through deconstruction and become cynical atheists or whatever,
Yeah.
who I'm like, did you ever meet him? And I'm like, what a disservice the church has done wherever it raised
Mm,
people without facilitating an encounter with the living one.
yeah.
And if he's just an idea or a doctrine, then he can be displaced by the next idea or doctrine or ideology that comes along that feels a little better. But
Mm,
if we've known him somehow, and I explore that living connection isn't one thing. It's not always like a dramatic encounter, but
hmm.
a real and living connection with a person. That's not so easy to walk away from, and it means everything
Yeah.
else can burn, and it's not a problem. You know, I guess he's the embers. So
Oh. that makes me think about Bonaventure talks about the burning love of the crucified one, and
Oh,
that
wow.
it's in Christ that we have the collision of opposites, the goodness of God and the suffering of man, as you had mentioned. I was thinking earlier this past week of the image of Joseph of Arimathea, and I think that this image might be a little troublesome to some people, but the idea that Joseph laid Jesus to rest and buried him was a part that led up to the resurrection.
Wow.
And just the idea that maybe for some people, perhaps this is going too far, I don't know. It feels as though right now we need something of the opposite of a midwife. We need to help people put, bury into the ground their ideas of Jesus so that the better one can actually come next. You could say water into wine, you can mix the metaphors however you want. And I understand the tomb as womb is a really good analogy as well. When Christ comes out, he's giving birth to a new humanity. But I think that there's been so few people present to speak to the death of what we had. Does that make sense? So that
Oh,
we
yeah.
have this space for the next Christianity. I don't know if that's the right word. The next Reformation to give
Yeah.
birth to what Christianity can become for us now. Is that too
Yeah.
far?
Well, first of all, my experience is that too far has not been the problem. Not
Okay.
doing half-assed has been the problem. A lot of the happy clappy deconstructionism
Mm,
has not gone far enough, and so I'm totally with you on this. Um, I do I do think that for some, um, midwifery can be a really good analogy,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
but Jesus and Paul talk about death and resurrection,
mm,
and so what is dying, and what is being raised to life. I do resonate with you on this. In fact, I have a story. Here's what I'm really grateful about. I have fresh stories about this every week, and so
people
I'm
just
not just,
email you?
yeah, or I meet them. So I have a friend named Craig in Australia, and he said he's been working with a guy who he's an evangelist of all things for the Salvation Army, and he says, like, this guy came in to work through some recovery stuff with a program he was running with the Salvation Army, but the guy was so hateful of Christianity. He's like, I just can't handle it. I don't want to hear the name Jesus ever. And Christians are part of the problem. And he was right. So he leaves the program and disappears. Well, he comes back a few years later. He's just contacted Craig again this last week, and he's like, actually, um, I looked for healing everywhere else but Christianity. So he did a trek through Asia. He
Oh,
tried on
wow.
Hinduism, he tried on Buddhism, he was trying all their stuff, and actually a lot of them have very helpful things if you know where they're coming from. I don't know that he did. I just know it didn't work for him. So now
Mm.
he comes back full circle, having buried Christianity. And even then, he's like, Craig, I need your help, but you still can't use the name Jesus. And I still won't be a Christian. And so Craig, in his wisdom, said, could we try this? I want you to ask perfect love to pour perfect love into you
Oh.
and see if that will help. So they did. And the guy immediately be, entered a process where over the last week or so, every day it's like he just constantly feels this outpouring of perfect love from the one
Mm.
who Craig is calling perfect love, who Craig and I agree is Jesus. But Jesus is like so humble that he's willing to heal
Yeah.
this guy anonymously, right? Which is what AA and all those guys were doing in the first place. It
Uh-huh.
was like God
Uh-huh.
is love, and if his name has been bastardized in our culture, and he has to come by another name. Perfect love is quite a good one.
Yeah.
And I'm not offended if Jesus isn't offended, like isn't withholding that liberating flow, then no. So come back to what you've just said. Then it's like maybe that's what had to happen for this guy.
Oh,
Maybe
mm,
he had to put to death everything associated with the kind of Christianity that had actually exacerbated his addictions. And
wow.
maybe in doing so, something's come to life. But like the disciples, they don't recognize them after the resurrection, some of
That's
them. Like,
right. Oh, that does go
and
further. Okay.
yeah. So, I mean, this'll preach, man, but I'll leave it to you to do. I
Uh,
love that image. So just to reiterate, no, I don't think you've gone too far with it.
yeah.
Um, rebirth and death. Oh, one side note. P.S. I have an amazing student right now. He's about my age. He's he's the former head of palliative care in the
Wow.
hospital in our city, and he's doing his MA in theology and culture. And his MA thesis is on training hospice care workers palliative care workers to
Hmm.
be midwives for death.
Wow.
It's like awesome, and I'm thinking that is really relevant to this
Sure.
conversation. um, Being midwives to bring to death the idolatrous images of God that
Mm.
have to be come down, but all not. And also, someone on Twitter the other day called it divinely assisted egocide.
Oh, I saw
So,
that. That was
is
really
that
good.
interesting?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
maybe that was you. You probably said that, right?
No, no, I was like,
Some other.
it actually reminds me, there's in Sufism, there's the idea of fana, Fana. I'm not sure how you pronounce it or spell it in Arabic, but the idea is ego annihilation.
Yeah,
And I thought that was gorgeous.
yeah. And just to do a little caveat there. So so there are those who would say no, you have to have an ego to have
Right.
like you don't annihilate your personhood. But egoism, if that's what we mean. So in 12 step recovery we'll talk about the ego, but what we
Mm,
mean is the enthroned ego, the demanding
mm.
ego, that. So it's not, maybe not actually the death of the ego, but it is the death of the reign of the ego. As
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And no, but others would say, no, no, it's the death of the ego. Like probably Simone Weil would do that. And I'm like, but she was pretty willful herself. So, yeah.
Well, let's start to close it out. I really do think your book is a fantastic final statement on deconstruction. Tell people when they're ready, and if it helps them to go ahead and read it. I think that some people will be surprised at how vulnerable parts of the certain stories are. I
Mhm.
don't think that the theology will be off-putting. I actually found in my own work, people are often amazed when they find out really good theology from Gregory of Nyssa or the Cappadocians. They're like, how come I was never told this before? I was like, I know, right? This should be
Right.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, but if deconstruction as a phase in America is starting to shift behind us, what do you hope would be the thing that happens next for all of us?
Okay. Well, and this is where my conversations with my godfather were so helpful. So what I hope is that we find a trajectory from alienation to communion. So deconstruction, as
Oh
necessary
yeah,
as it is, has been experienced by a lot of people as kind of alienating. They're like, I had to leave that, but now I'm lonely. Okay,
believers, as you call it.
yeah, the
Yeah.
believers, yeah. And so um and even those who just maybe weren't part of something like that, but this idea of alienation, I think, is a hallmark of our culture right now.
Mm,
So
hmm.
if we go from alienation to communion, what would that mean? And so my godfather, David Goa, he calls that um, uh, presence in communion. In other words, where you and I are present to one another, we
Mm.
are in communion, and that happens everywhere that we have exchanges of grace. And that can be that can be everywhere. So
Mm.
in the Orthodox tradition, what it is to be a royal priesthood is to be a priesthood for the whole world, entering into these grace connections. So, like for example, my wife and I spent an hour in an Uber the other day on our way to the airport,
Uh-huh.
where we had a powerful grace connection with a secular Iranian woman who has to go back into Iran
Wow.
like a week from now, and her family is there, and there's this incredible danger. And but my wife is so good at listening and so good at engaging. I'm watching this exchange of grace, and I'm like, this is communion.
Mm.
And we were receiving from her, and hopefully she was receiving from us. Then we get on a plane, we go down to Miami, and we're doing a retreat, but my wife was leading the women, so I went and hid in a rabbi's office because this group shares space with a synagogue.
Uh-huh.
Well, this rabbi comes in. Her name's Robin, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in your office." She's like, "No, no, stay." And I'm like, "But what are you doing?" And she said, "Well, we've got to do the bar mitzvah stuff for the girls." And I'm
Uh-huh.
like, "Oh, really?" And she goes, "Do you want to stay?" So I just sat there, and for the next 2 hours, I was one of the 13-year-old girls
Oh.
taking preparing for this, and getting my Hebrew lesson and learning about Leah and why the fourth child is so important because Judah's name is praised. And I'm like, what? And I
Uh-huh.
and she was so hospitable. And then I made amends where I could for where Christians had
Mm.
expressed anti-Semitism towards her, and she really talked about friendship of divine humans in connection. I'm like, oh, good Lord, this is that again. So that's what I'm thinking, right? And so it's not about a big movement that's top down. It's about I could
Mm.
what I hope is that in our sense of lack, like we felt it in lockdown,
Mm-hmm. That's true.
in my neighborhood, in lockdown, we were so frustrated by the enforced alienation by the pandemic that we rebelled, not in irresponsible ways, but we finally, after 10 years, learned our neighbors' names. I'm like, what was 10 years? I didn't know their names. It took COVID for me to care.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I think that for me is the central outcome that I'm hoping for and trying to sow into alienation to presence in communion, which is the kingdom of God, which is grace, which is
Oh,
maybe a church bigger than Christianity. So,
that's a very loaded statement. I'm in favor of it. A church larger than Christianity. The
yeah.
idea that these words are actually more expansive than we were told.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, I just finished reading Jordan Daniel Wood's book,
Yes.
Maximus the Confessor.
Maximus.
I just finished it
Yeah.
like 3 days ago, and the idea of the logoi everywhere, that somehow everything is an echo of the primary logos, and
Yes.
but the dualism of saying what's sacred and not sacred, rather than learning to see the Christ in everyone and everything. Maybe that's
Yeah.
part of what needed to crumble,
Yes.
the differentiation and not being able to see the Christ in everything.
Yeah, and people don't need to worry that we're going to discard Jesus in the mix. I have a friend, Safi
Mm.
Kaskas. He's a Quranic scholar. He's translated the Quran, and he calls me. He's a Muslim, and he's like, Brad, I need you to help me. I've been invited to talk about interfaith peacemaking at a university in Pakistan, but Jesus said we must do this two by two. So would you go with me? And I'm like, what?
That's amazing.
Yeah. So Safi, so what is he doing there? He's not. He's seeing bigger than our divisions, but he's not requiring an erasure of our distinctiveness. He's saying, "Come as a Christian. I'll come as a Muslim." We're not going to water down our faith. We're going to say
Right.
these faiths can coexist in love and compete for goodness with each other and partner in peacemaking, so that he says, because so it's him saying, so this is what Jesus means by blessed are the peacemakers, they will be the children of God. Do you want to be a peacemaker with me? Should we go obey Jesus together? I'm like, but you're a Muslim. And he's like, you can't be a good Muslim and not follow Jesus. Have you not read the Quran? Like, well, now I have. But anyway, so this kind of thing, it blows my mind, and it's probably where that's another thing where we're heading next, I think. Exactly what Maximus will do for us, and what Wood will do for us, to find
Right.
uh, Christ in everywhere and in all things,
Right.
drawing us to Himself.
Oh, it's beautiful. So last question.
Okay.
Last one. Do you have an idea of what a next book could be? Do you have a new book already percolating in you? Has writing this brought up new things for you that you'd like to comment on next?
In fact, yes. So uh, I haven't distilled it all down, but
Yeah.
in my mind, it's the intersection of two things I'm seeing, so that we've already raised today. So
Okay.
the intersection of the need for a living connection with ultimate reality, and a Christian explanation for why I see it beyond Christianity.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and some of that will be stories of, my agnostic friends who are addicts, who are going, I don't believe in God, but I can tell you this: whatever God is or isn't is in me and in you and bigger than both of
Wow.
us, and it's changing us and transforming us. Now, this is the agnostics talking. So I'm like, okay, how does a Christian talk about this?
Uh-huh.
Um, and so if I can work out how to describe that, you'll see it in my next book. But I have lots of stories. It's just
Those are great.
hard
They're
to
fun.
it's hard to do it's hard to talk about without getting accused of something. But my
Yeah.
dear wife, she always says, well, who's gonna hate us this time? But we don't care anymore.
Well, I think you do fantastic work for the world. Thank you so much. I really think you're one of the best voices for Christianity in the West right now. I can't speak globally because I can only read English. So,
Well, that's very kind. It's so weird, right? Because my sense of disqualification somehow appeals to you as a qualification. But where they meet is that mercy. So thanks for showing me mercy and for hearing me out.
all right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great day. All right.
Thank you. You as well.